3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Hi, good afternoon and good morning, or depending wherever you are, and welcome to the 17th Eurocontrol strategic webinar in our Stakeholder Forum series. I'm Philip Hughes and I'm Head of Stakeholder Management at Eurocontrol. And today I have the pleasure of moderating a webinar on the hot topic of space launches and their impact on the European ATM network. Now, for European aviation, space operations are very much the here and now and not something remote in the future. Small satellites are ushering in a new era of capabilities, and the global space launch market is growing, but lower costs in putting satellites into low Earth orbit. Now, such satellites serve many societal needs, including better monitoring of the climate, bringing the internet to underserved communities and managing disaster recovery and so on. So they're very much a big societal advantage. And in Europe, the number of satellite providers is increasing and there are several launches in the pipeline. So the first commercial spaceport is expected to enter into service in Cornwall, from where Virgin Orbit will shortly launch. Other operational launch sites are currently being built right throughout Europe, and we expect to see a significant increase in sub-orbital and orbital launches right across Europe. This growth trend is set to continue, increasing demand for access to higher airspace, and again highlighting the importance of managing the integration of satellite launches with conventional air traffic in a safe, sustainable and efficient manner. Now, space operations at high altitude, so satellite launches, re-entry and space debris, need to be safely deconflicted with operations with other airspace users. So this is very much a hot topic at the moment as to how we can do this. So from our perspective, from Eurocontrol's perspective, the impact on new airspace entrants such as new satellite providers on air traffic management. So those functions need to be very clearly identified as to how we can manage it, because we have a strong coordination role in terms of doing that. So in this webinar, industry experts will help us to understand the bigger picture and shed light on the main challenges that we need to address to build the required ecosystem for integrating space flights and space debris into conventional air traffic. So to discuss the challenges of integrating space flights into conventional traffic, we have an impressive lineup of industry experts with us today. We have Scott McCurdy, who is head of future flight and space flight in the Department of Transport in the UK. We've Mark Dickinson, Vice President of Space Segment and Deputy CTO for Inmarsat. And last but not least, we have Jacopo Pincinotti, who is the Director of the Network Management function here in Eurocontrol. So you're all very welcome. And before I begin, just some short housekeeping rules. So to shape today's discussion, participants can submit questions using the Q&A function. If you encounter any technical issues or any other general remarks, you can use the chat function. So I'll ask each of the presenters just to give us a brief introduction on their perspective on the issue, and we can start from there. So first of all, I give the floor to our first speaker, Scott McCurdy. Scott, over to you.
Thank you, Philip. Great to be with you all today. It's a real privilege to work here in this kind of pivotal moment, and especially at the Department for Transport. We've had a very busy few months as we prepare for the first space launch from mainland Europe. Although debating on what's mainland, what's not, is always a fun experience. Space is one of the kind of great challenges of our time, and it's very, very hard from all stages of the process. for the technical aspects through to the regulatory, all the way to the international cooperation piece. And that's been a real challenge as we kind of see this increased demand. You know, the UK space industry is around £17 billion a year already, and we expect that to continue to grow. And to meet that demand, we've had to get well ahead of the process and look at where the challenges are on the market. And one of those challenges is around the availability of launch in the world. As we've seen, especially in the last year, the launch market isn't sufficient to meet demand, and that is without external factors such as the war in Ukraine having a significant impact on our ability to procure launches. That opens up what was already an established market that we could see, and we've already seen really substantial growth and interest in the UK. So I'm very happy to say, as of this morning, we licensed our very first spaceport in Spaceport Cornwall. That was a very long night on a lot of our parts to get that over the line, but that is just the first. We actually have 2 more spaceports in fairly advanced stages with the consultation for sub-orbital spaceport ongoing. And we have several launch companies interested, both UK launch companies and overseas launch companies. And that in itself is a challenge. Working with international partners is required at all stages of the process. So from our work with the FAA, helping to design our new regulations, so the UK as the first country in the world to have fully commercial spaceflight regulations. We're designed to be commercial, not state-sponsored. We worked with the FAA to help design those and did a lot of work over many years internally in the UK to bring that to fruition. That was really challenging, and it continues to be a real challenge as we kind of take that through the advanced stages of operationalizing it. We're currently negotiating a bilateral agreement with the United States to make it smoother to regulate and license. Licensing is definitely the hardest part of the process at this stage, but it's going pretty well. Just some kind of key statistics. The UK said we'd be able to license launches at spaceports with about 9 to 18 months. And currently we're tracking less than 12 for most applications. So I think that's a real testament to the hard work that's gone in. I think, you know, what we're looking forward to, first and foremost, and what I think is really the thing a lot of people want to talk about, is the upcoming Virgin Orbit launch, which we really hope to be able to get over the line before the end of this year. That's definitely a challenge as we navigate through this busy period, and the air traffic is one of the biggest aspects of that. The ability to integrate this operation into a wider scenario traffic in the middle of a busy tourist season as the rocket flies in a southern trajectory. That's a real challenge, and hopefully can help to bring some of those complications out today. Bro, Philip, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Sounds like you've gone through a long, difficult process to get where you are. So congratulations on the licensing of the new port. Mark, hand over to you. What's the Inmarsat perspective on this?
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I think I've got a couple of charts to show here. So I'm going to try and provide a perspective of where we, as a satellite operator, we see launch going in the future. As you're aware, the launch for the first 50 years of space has really been the domain of nation states and governments. So the US, the Europeans, China, and more recently through with India. I'm not sure, there's a chart, can we put the charts up? Okay, while I wait for that, I'll talk to. So this has really been, yes, it's been nation states who have been having launch activities. That's changed somewhat in the last 10 years or so. We're all well aware of what companies like SpaceX are doing, but they're not the only ones who are commercializing space. And we talked about Virgin Orbit, there's other companies as well. And what's driving that? We're seeing more and more missions go to space. There's more and more uses for space. And that is either there are, it's not just simply broadcast and telecommunications or for governments as it used to be, but climate change, environmental monitoring. There's a whole range of use cases now for access to space. And that's driving a whole new different type of spacecraft. So not spacecraft which weigh thousands of kilograms, which has sort of been the more traditional spacecraft, but sometimes satellites which are only the size of a shoebox. Or we've seen the advent of mega constellations. These are satellite systems of many hundreds or thousands of spacecraft, which require a huge number of launches. So we've seen the quantity of launches go up, but we're also seeing the new entrants into the space market and the commercialization of space. I'm not sure, are we able to, yeah, okay. So this chart says, if you just look back for the last 5 years, we can see the number of launches increasing. China is actually the dominant, still has the highest launch rate at the moment. The blue lines are the US, and we actually now have to break out Starlink. This is a SpaceX mega constellation into a lighter blue color. And then we have Russia behind them. Europe has a relatively small number of launches compared to the global number, and most of those are flown out of French Guiana in South America. Okay, if we can go to the next chart. So what we're seeing now, as I mentioned, is the entrance of sort of new space, commercial entrants who are looking to be able to launch these smaller satellites. So with the Virgin Orbit launch, we're seeing satellites which weigh the order of tens of kilograms, even up hundreds of kilograms, but not the thousands of kilograms. And although Europe has a relatively small number of launches historically compared to China and the US, in the new space market, they're very active. And this chart, if you look to the right of this chart, there's a whole number of new entrants coming in with European flags who want to be able to provide these new commercial services. And this technology is maturing fast, and I'm sure a number of them will be successful. And these launches, some of them are planned from Europe. So this will be the first time really we have a significant number of launches actually happening within European airspace. So yes, there's a real commercialization of space. The number of launches will increase rapidly over the next decade as these new space missions are launched. Next chart. Okay, so they say what goes up must come down. That's normally the case, but when it comes back down, you normally hope it's going to be done in a controlled manner. Occasionally, that doesn't happen, and we have a recent event to point to. So the Chinese launched a Long March 5B at the very end of October. The mission was successful in terms of deploying the asset. The unfortunate part was that a large part of that rocket body re-entered in an uncontrolled way, and large is large. This is 22 tons of rocket coming back down to Earth, and that will burn up or break up in the atmosphere, but a significant part of it will actually reach sea level. Normally this is done the re-entry is done in a controlled way, and you have a planned area, typically in the Pacific, where you ditch your thing that's coming in. But in this case, this was an uncontrolled, and actually where it's going to come in is not known very accurately until very late in the process. If you look on the left-hand side, this was an analysis performed 12 hours before the actual re-entry, and the uncertainty over that 12-hour period was plus or minus 3 hours. That actually translates into many orbits around the Earth, and that the yellow and blue track you can see are the tracks before the minus 3 hours is the yellow, and the plus 3 hours is the blue. So it's actually covering over that uncertainty period of 12 hours before re-entry. So it's covering a large amount of land mass and over the oceans as well. And each tick you can see, each little mark on that line is 5 minutes. So you can see how fast this object is and how difficult it is to plan for in terms of exactly where it's going to impact. And you can see that there's a number of those lines which go through Spain and Portugal, and I know they took some measures to counter the risk. These uncontrolled re-entries shouldn't happen. Re-entry should be done in a planned way for exactly this reason, because there's a casualty risk as well as an operational implication for this activity. So, yeah, hopefully steps are taken in the future to limit these activities or these situations. But when they happen, the uncertainties of exactly where it's going to hit cause big problems for everyone. So hopefully this can improve in the future.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's very interesting. Obviously, the increased level of demand in Europe is, as we said, been very important. So maybe I'll hand over now to the man at the sharp end. Jacopo, you're the guys who have to do or deal with some of the fallout, so to speak, in terms of this. What's the NM view on this whole system?
Yeah, thank you, Philip, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to say that we in Eurocontrol and within the Eurocontrol Network Manager have as one of the fundamental priorities the full integration of all the new entrants, and of course, in this case, especially for the high altitude ones. And I will pick it up with where Mark left it, because I think I would like to use this example of this Chinese rocket re-entry in October to really show the impact that an uncoordinated approach at European level will have and has had. So if you put the first slide up that I made, you will, which is not this one, of course. Thank you. Not even this one. I think we're getting there. Okay, yes, this one. I think this clearly shows what has happened during the rocket re-entry in the European airspace because of an uncoordinated approach. So I will make a long story short. Those are all the areas that you see have been blocked in terms of airspace. But what is more important is to focus on the central slide. So you see the blue lines are the expected trajectory of the re-entry of the rocket. The red lines are the aircrafts. And you see that the opportunity was for Greece, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal to eventually be in that trajectory. Two states, namely Greece and Portugal, didn't do anything, more or less. Italy has decided, of course, to communicate through NOTAMs to this possible risk to the aircraft operators. Spain, well in advance, has organized an airspace closure that you've seen in the smaller pictures, while France, at the very last moment, had suddenly decided for closing the airspace on the trajectory that you see in the south part of Marseille, ACC, which more or less is in the middle of the Mediterranean area, which of course caused some holdings of aircraft that you see the red lines over Sardinia. So in a nutshell, this uncoordinated approach has created, let's say, even more risks, if I may say so, into the system in terms of these trajectories possibly entering in that area, but also has created a lot of disruption in the network. So based on this, I think one of the most important actions that we are doing here in Eurocontrol is to work really hard to have a normalized approach in the network. And for this rocket re-entry, uncontrolled rocket re-entry, and I share full the view of Mark about the importance of making sure that as much as possible they become controlled re-entries. We are starting with the European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell to organize a safety risk assessment to really understand what is the level of risk that we have, and connected to that immediately after to organize standard operational procedures over Europe to avoid that we have such a let's say a dishomogeneous situation that we had in the last re-entry. And also we will work closely with the EASA to ensure all what information is needed is based on safety case, which is very solid, coordinated also with them. So this is the first step, which is really to look at the re-entry and the uncontrolled re-entry, which can create a lot of disruption into the network. The second point, if you go to the next slide, is of course all the strategy to support all these commercial launches, being, let's say, in terms of airspace management, and being, of course, also in terms of re-entry. I think one of the most important things is that we already started already since a year. We have a project called Integration of New Entrants in European ATM Operations. It's fully coordinated. It's worked with the Director of Operations and the Director of Technology of all the major partners, but also in full and close coordination with the European Commission and with all the member states, which remain, of course, the full owners of the process. And on those bases, we have now just finalized the first step, which is the impact assessment, and we're finalizing now the implementation plan and the roadmap to really structure the deployment of all the operational procedures to ensure that everything is managed in the best way possible in terms of integrating fully these newcomers into the system and making sure that we can provide the best quality possible to all the efforts that they're going to make to launches. And as you all heard, they're going to grow in time. So this is also something very important needs to happen and will happen within the next couple of years from our side. Now, a couple of points. One, first of all, is to ensure, as usual, is the network manager, full integration of everyone. So we apply what we call the cooperative decision-making process with all the stakeholders. It's based on existing and very valuable procedures that we use also with the military. So on one side, it's of strong support to operations. On the next point, if you can bring it up, it's really to have a single planning process definition. And to this end, we're making a fundamental use of the excellent cooperation that we're having with the FAA since years, and build on also their long-lasting experience that they already have. And this is something which for us has been also very instrumental to accelerate the implementation of the new procedures that will happen in the next years. And the last is also, if you bring up the last point, is also that through this, we also contribute robustly to all the research and regulatory initiatives. So all in all, an holistic approach from Eurocontrol, which will work really hard as a priority to support all these newcomers and really integrate them to the best way possible. With just a final recommendation, it has to be seen from the network perspective. Otherwise, we end up with the first slide that I showed. Back to you, Philip.
Thanks, Jacopo. So, 3 very interesting scene-setting presentations, I think. So I think it basically falls into 2 types of categories. There's the planned launches, and then there's the unplanned events like the Chinese situation. If we start with the planned events, I'd ask each of you, what are the kind of the near-term challenges that need to be addressed, starting, for instance, with the commercial piece, which you, Scott, and then in the industry terms, and then Jacopo. What do we need to do in the short term to deal with the bits we know about, which is the plan bit, given the kind of the institutional fragmentation and complexity in the way which Europe organises airspace? Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the planned launches, you know, require months of work. They are incredibly challenging operations to do. You know, I've had a team working on one launch, you know, full time for the last year. Several months of which have been focused very heavily around managing the airspace. We've got large teams at the Civil Aviation Authority. It's, you know, it is a difficult process to manage. You know, we've had to do a lot of negotiation with various partners. So, and that includes, it's not just international partners, it's not just managing the airspace. When you're dealing with commercial companies, they have commercial pressures. You know, in an ideal world, in a state-funded operation, you might, as the US regularly does, says, okay, we'll just not do it today. You can have quite long lead times, whereas when you're dealing with commercial companies, they're publicly held, they've got significant pressures to launch, make progress, be seen to make progress. That doesn't necessarily be, it's not necessarily conducive to good planning, where you're trying to manage multiple stakeholders and arrange around a window of dates that line up things like your weather, your readiness, your licensing operations, and the wider world around you. So if you look at the Virgin Orbit launch, because we have a southern trajectory, we're passing over quite a lot of very busy bits of airspace, in particular around Madeira and the Canary Islands. Those are really challenging bits of airspace, especially at this time of year where we have quite a busy tourist season and lots of low-level operations in and around those islands on a regular basis anyway. So arranging that confluence of activities is really hard, and you know, Eurocontrol has been fantastic in assisting in doing the demand modelling to help us work with our international partners to come to an agreement. And it's been a fantastic process in respect that we're all on the same side. You know, this has been a very kind of apolitical process. We all agree the value of space, the importance of having access to space for Europe. You know, it crosses beyond a lot of the kind of normal political challenges we have on a day-to-day basis. We all agree that it's important and that we should accommodate this activity wherever we can. But that doesn't mean it's not hard. You know, we've gone from, to take an example with Virgin Orbit, we've gone, you know, as the launch pushes one direction and your timings push the other, you start to narrow down from a very large range of days to a very small range of days. So when you look at the month of December, you very suddenly go from, say, oh, well, I could have, you know, before Christmas, there's 3 weeks. But when you actually start to do your demand modeling and work out what your operational limitations are, both on the ground, in the air, you suddenly get down to, oh, hang on, I've only got 4 or 5 days where it's genuinely doable. And then you have maybe a handful of days where you could maybe, with a bit of hard work, squeeze it in. So it's a really, really difficult process, and it involves a lot of moving parts that you need to manage. And it's the kind of prior preparation point can't be overemphasized. And the fact that you have unplanned events, how much work it takes to do a planned event, just shows you the kind of how big an impact they can have. Yeah, so I'll pass back to others who I think probably have some thoughts themselves.
Mark, what about you? What's your view on the kind of the near-term challenges for planned launches?
So just to follow on from what Scott was saying, it is launching satellites is a complex business, and often when you have a planned launch, things don't go to plan, and you have maybe you only want to launch when you know the spacecraft and the rocket is going to be safe. You may see signatures during the process of launching that actually means you want to not abort the launch and not go at that time and retry again in a day or two's time. You may have something called a launch window. Sometimes you don't actually have to go exactly at a specific time. You can go within a window of time. And I've been involved in launch campaigns that have been delayed by days, and even launch campaigns being delayed by weeks. You sit there ready to go, and half an hour before launch, it gets aborted, and you come back tomorrow or you come back next week. So even the planned activities have a large amount of potential unplanned nature to them. Can be weather, can be technical issues. What you can't do is get ready for a launch and then come back next year, because you have all the operational teams ready. You have launch vehicles ready. Spacecraft which are being fueled, for example. So you have this natural uncertainty of things can happen even during a very planned activity, and having the ability to flex around that will be an important operational need.
Okay, so Jacopo, given all of these variables, trying to coordinate for a near-term launch must be challenging, and particularly given the level of increases which we're looking at, that's surely got to be a big challenge in the longer term.
Yeah, you're fully right, Philip. And allow me to add another couple of additional complexity, if I may say. European airspace is very different from the American and the US airspace. More complex. The trajectories of the flights have totally different patterns, and so this adds more complexity than let's say the American environment. The other complexity was said before. It's about the commercial pressure which is on the companies which are making the launches. Here, I think the good thing is that Eurocontrol is very used to that. Of course, we manage aviation, we manage a lot of airlines which are highly in competition with them. So with it, considering all that, and considering, as you correctly said, Philippe, that it's something which is growing, we're tackling this very, very carefully. On one side, the work that I described before, which essentially is to really organize very well the impact assessment, the risk assessments, and how to harmonize the procedures to allow for these launches to be done safely by not penalizing either of the two, because the risk is on one side on the commercial launches, but on the other side is also on aviation, because I mean, you could be tempted to close completely an airspace for a very large portion of airspace, creating a significant disruption in the aviation network, or on the other side, you tend to limit the commercial launch. So the balance is that needs to be kept is very important, and the work to prepare the launch. That's why we're so careful in addressing the process from the operational point of view, because the operational procedures and all the steps to ensure that both, let's say, parts are totally supported and the outcome does not penalize neither is very articulated. That's why we already started since a year the process in place. That's why we're benefiting from all the experience from the FAA, and that's why also starting from this first launch, we plan to have such operational procedures, and on one side allow to close the airspace while and reopen the airspace even while the launch is happening, again using the experience also of the Americans. On the other side, to work really hard, and this is a plea also that will come from our side, to receive anticipated information, and we, as honest broker, to guarantee the confidentiality and the commercial value of those information. Of course, everybody knows very well that before the launch, there are certain steps where you know that the launch might be canceled even before it's canceled. And everybody knows that there are certain moments during the fueling that things might be stopped or they might be already confirmed. All that relevant information needs to be known in order to provide the best service possible. And that's something we will need to figure out how to best manage, of course, to ensure the commercial and confidence of such level of information. But that thing, I think, Philip, is a very important part.
Okay. So it sounds like the sharing of the information, doing it in a much more coordinated way is probably something important. And I presume that Europe is not as advanced, for instance, as the US, where we wouldn't have as much experience in this particular kind of exercise.
I will catch up very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So that covers the kind of planned events. Now, the unplanned events, which you touched on, is obviously more concerning in some ways, because if I look at Mark's chart, you can see the speed at which the Chinese rocket was descending and the level of uncertainty and the way in which we have to react. So what's people's views about what are the issues around that, and how should we coordinate, and what are the lessons learned? So Scott, from a commercial point of view, what's your view on that?
Well, yeah, it's one of the real challenges when you're doing the reactive work. A lot of the infrastructure you require to do that is not commercial infrastructure. It's state infrastructure. Most of the monitoring around for collision avoidance for satellites, while it's on the commercial side greatly increasing in capability, the infrastructure and the facilities to manage that infrastructure, make decisions, sit with the states, and that's the real challenge. And there's lots of great work already. It's not a new area, but as we start to increase the frequency of these types of unplanned events, that's something that's definitely going to have to change. And there is real questions around: is the existing model fit for purpose? Is it capable of growing and scaling with the industry in space as it grows? And that's one of those keys. And how it's the same with us on the planned launches. How do you mesh commercial with state functions? Because airspace as a state function is always largely going to be. How do you mesh and make these systems interact with each other in a dynamic, efficient, effective way is the real challenge when you're doing it under time pressure. And how much of that sits with the states, how much of that sits outside it, is a real question. There's not a real clear answer on, and it's easy to do for one state. In the UK, we've got a really robust system for doing it, and each country often has a robust system of doing it. But as Eurocontrol knows well, getting all the countries to play well together is an entirely different situation.
So, Mark, getting all the countries to play together sounds like a challenge. You might also touch on the tracking of the debris, which you spoke about in your presentation, because I'm interested to know how that works in a collective way.
Sure. So maybe we'll tackle that first. So there are a number of entities around the world who track what's up in space. They have either radars or optical systems. The US has a big space sensor network run out the 18th Space Command. That's complemented with some commercial activities as well. We've seen companies like Leo Labs, Exoanalytics, who have sensors trying to detect where objects are. And in Europe, we have EUSST as well, which is a European Union activity to be able to maintain the safety of European assets. And the job there is to be able to monitor where these objects are and predict where they're going to be in the future. The issue when it comes to re-entry is that it's a complex beast to try and work out exactly what the physics is. The atmosphere and the role the sun plays and how the atmosphere behaves creates lots of uncertainty about exactly how it's going to re-enter. So it's even with good tracking, it's all you can do is sort of get better uncertainty over time, but there's a large amount of uncertainty as part of for something as such a large rocket body as 22,000 kilos. There are international standards and international best practices. I can't comment whether this was a planned unplanned or whether this was an unplanned activity. And I think the US I said should direct questions to the Chinese authorities about how this happened, but it shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be part of space operations and norms of behaviour. It's important that we don't both create debris in space for future collisions and access to space, but it's important, very important, that stuff that's put into space, when it comes back in, it's done in a environmentally sustainable way and doesn't cause casualty risk and doesn't cause operational impacts to aviation networks. So yeah, there are standards. Whether the standards are followed or whether the best practice was followed, I can't comment on. Refined tracking, better capabilities for tracking will always help, but it's never going to give you an X marks the spot answer.
Okay. All right. Sounds like a Donald Rumsfeld quote there, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns and so on. So yeah, I can see that. Jacopo, in your presentation, if I read it correctly, looking at the graphs, I think the word inconsistency springs to mind in the way in which it was dealt with. At a European level, I mean, does something like the European coordination cell in terms of crises, how would you go about trying to start getting this to all work together?
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, allow me to say that I fully agree with both points that Marcus said. This shouldn't happen, should be, let's say, organized in a different way. And the fact that the predictability of where they will land is really, I mean, even if it's improved, it's really very far likelihood to be consistent. So what we're doing here is on one side, we are, of course, considering, as was also said before by Scott, of course, the importance of the role of the states. So we are activating what we call the European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell, which is set out under the Single European Sky Regulation, which is the cell composed by all the member states, plus, of course, all the major institutions like EASA, like ICAO. And with them, we are now reviewing what I said before, the safety case around this re-entry, uncontrolled re-entry. And the safety case essentially is, we're doing it very similar to the volcano eruption debris, in order to this end to look really at what is a realistic approach to the possible impact, which we believe is, of course, is very, 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 very low, much lower than any other impact that we consider not a risk for aviation. But I don't want to anticipate any outcome, but it's going to be most probably going that direction. And on top, following that, we will propose to the states a common operational procedure. And of course, it will be up to the states then to decide to adopt that common operational procedure, which we will strongly recommend as Eurocontrol. And together with that, we will, of course, also work very closely with EASA to ensure that all the information bulletins that will be provided will be fully in line with that step. And again, EASA, as from the beginning, is fully involved through the EACCC in the definition of the safety case with of course, an important leadership there. So with this approach, we believe that we will quickly get through this complexity that we had with this Chinese rocket re-entry. And of course, in the meantime, let's say, until we will get this in place, the network manager will organize some days before some executive meetings to ensure that at least there is an alignment of approach from the states while waiting for the common operational procedures to be in place.
Okay, thanks, Jacopo. Interesting that it sounds that in terms of assessment, the risk is much less than previous one, but it feels a little bit like, as you say, we're back to where we are with the ash crisis, where because of the unknown, the amount of sanitized airspace becomes very, very high. Can I come back to another point, and about the tension between the state and the commercial piece? We've a number of questions coming in here now. Nick Robson, for instance, is saying that, you know, planned launches are complex with necessary coordination and deconfliction, but indeed that this activity may, both in terms of civil and mil, lead to disruption of airspace. So who actually gets to pay for all of that? And we've also questions in here from from Alda Miranda in Portugal in terms of what about the charging model in terms of how all of this works, and Gerhard Wagner is the same thing. What's the charging arrangement for such flights? So you might touch on that first of all, because as you know, Scott, as you said, it's a 17 billion pound industry in the UK, and that inevitably is going to give rise to stuff like that. And you might also touch on the relative models between, say, Europe and the US. Scott.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's definitely a challenge. So that conversation around who pays is definitely a real challenge as you transition from state-funded to commercial. And you know, you look at the US model, which is the very kind of archetypical state-funded model. So even as they are starting to become more commercial, and that's an intentional move from them, most of the infrastructure, the regulatory frameworks, they're all state-funded. The US government puts a lot of money into space. You know, the market, and that was necessary for the market. You know, it had to be state-funded. Only the states could make those interventions. We are now starting to get to the point where technology has advanced to such a stage where it is now commercially viable to do it without state intervention. Now, in the UK, we have that ambition to have a fully commercial market, and we know we're not quite there yet because, you know, for example, the Department for Transport still fully funds the regulator. So none of the kind of companies that are working in the UK in space are being charged for their regulation at the moment, which is not the case for aviation. We do charge for that. In the future, that is something we are actively reviewing as to when the market will be able to bear the price of being regulated, because we do have an industry pays approach, and that's the same across Europe and the world for the most part, is industry pays. As you start to see commercial launch increase in scale, that's something that's going to be much more of a strong argument that no, you shouldn't be supporting that from the taxpayers' funds. We're still not quite there yet, and you know, a lot of the launches are still very heavily state supported. So even in the UK, our first launch program is heavily supported by the UK government, both in terms of funding and resource. You know, we've got something around well over 100 people working almost exclusively on the launch programs in the UK, just in government, so, and regulators. So it's a large effort on our part. We do hope as it scales that will start to diminish, and there's, you know, launch one is Virgin Orbit, which is part of the UK Pathfinder launch program, but the second, third launches, it's pretty much a dead heat of whether that will be a fully commercially funded rocket or one that we've funded. So that's a really fantastic place for us to be in, but it does lead to those questions as to who pays. Okay. In terms of the airspace side, that is a definite question we've still got to kind of work out, is who pays for disruption. That's a question that we still haven't answered for the rest of aviation really very well at the best of times. So I think we're probably going to have to answer that in a more holistic way before we then try and work out how can we apply that model to space and then balance out the benefit versus the cost, because, you know, space has such huge benefits for us, and it allows us to have services and address our net zero commitments and climate change commitments in a way that we just can't do on Earth. So there is tangible value for the state. So balancing that is a real kind of tricky policy question, and hopefully as we get more evidence of these commercial operations and how much they've cost, how much that impact has been over the next few years, we'll be able to start to build out an economic model that helps protect the public and encourages the good behaviours of industry, because that's everybody, you know, regulation is not there to help just stop industry doing things, it's there to help it do things better, and good regulation does that. And that's what we want to build, is good regulation that supports good responsible behaviours, both in the airspace and when you're in space.
Okay, so Mark, from your side, I mean, it feels to me like you're in a very early stage in terms of industry development with some of these things and commercial launches. But given the kind of state-private industry vested interest, is there opportunities for things like public-private partnerships or different kind of funding models which might work to drive this?
Yeah, I'm potentially. The way this commercially works from a satellite operator's perspective is that we don't buy a rocket, we buy a service, and it's a launch service providers. It's the Virgin Orbits, it's the SpaceX's, the ULAs, the Arianespaces of the world, who then provide a service. And as an operator, we're just a customer, we put our satellite on, and then they essentially, the service from them is to drop us off, and it's sort of the launch provider's responsibility to manage that process of providing that service. I would say that the vast majority of launch sites around the world have a large state element and typically military element to it at the moment still. If you go to Cape Canaveral, that's a US Air Force base, for example. There's a military person, there's someone in uniform sat in the room, typically with a finger on a button, and they can terminate the rocket if it deviates from the desired path. So even in the US, it's not a fully, as Scott was saying, there's a large state and often military element in terms of actually managing the launch process itself and how you secure the down range and how you protect the assets within that. So yeah, it's who has their finger on the button in the future for different launch sites will be an interesting question. Who takes responsibility for terminating a launch midway through flight and the consequences of that? Yeah, and it is a really complex issue with different stakeholders. But at the moment, typically the state have a big role to play in terms of actually the process of getting someone being able to provide that service.
Jacopo, what's your view in terms of who carries the can for a lot of this? I mean, operationally, you carry the can for a lot, but I think Mark has raised some interesting points there about who cuts it off and so on and so forth. What's the NM's view on this?
Well, I think, first of all, I would like to say that in general terms, and I fully concur with what was said also by Scott before, in general terms, we consider the airspace as a common asset for all the users, if they're military, if they're low altitude, or if it is rockets. And we need to avoid to enter into consideration of blocking things. We need to do all our best to ensure the full integration of everyone. And that's, I think, as Eurocontrol, that's the approach we have also in this case. Now, going to more effectively to what needs to be done, in order to achieve a full integration, and all these newcomers coming in, complexity grows significantly. And when complexity grows significantly, it's absolutely essential that on one side we have, as I said also before, a fully integrated network approach where the states play a pivotal role. And I think that's also the approach that we have been having in other areas of airspace usage, where it becomes essential that in order to avoid that it becomes a sort of a Eurocontrol proposing and the states in a fragmented way trying to have this approach, it needs to be that the states need to come together within a coordinated approach that eventually Eurocontrol can support in order to ensure that this holistic approach, as was said, happens. Because if we don't do that, it will be very difficult to succeed. And then when problems start to arise, there will be a sort of a finger pointing. We should stop that, we should stop this. I think this is the wrong approach. And I really genuinely think that the projects that we're now launching with the full participation of the states to ensure this full integration can be very supportive of the end role that the states need to take. But my take as Eurocontrol is that really there needs to be a step forward, and especially in Eurocontrol that we represent 41 member states. And as you know better than me, Philip, that with the big participation of UK and Turkey, this also points to solve one of the political elements of EU versus the rest of the world. And we are very prepared to support that. And we think that some good leadership of the leading states would be very helpful to this endeavor.
So building on that, let's start. So I think we've identified the problems and the complexity in terms of the coordination, and in some ways there are more questions than answers. In terms of the longer term issues, Mark already alluded to the variety of different space vehicles, etc., which will be required in the future. So there will have to be a program. I feel what we're doing at the moment is we're accommodating on an ad hoc basis something that's happening because of it's more immediate. I think in the longer term, we need to think about integration. Just taking the longer term view, and maybe I'll start with you, Jacopo, as you raised it. How, I know we have the research projects in terms of ECHO. I know other institutions like the European Space Agency and EASA and a variety of different people involved. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I said a little bit in my introduction, but first of all, I think we're talking anyway about trajectories. if they are aircraft launching a rocket, or if it's a rocket launched from the ground, if it's an airplane, if it's a drone, anyway, it's a trajectory. And based on that, on one side, we are developing a fundamental technological program in Eurocontrol, which is called INM, to be able in a very short term, in 3 or 4 years, even earlier, to manage those trajectories and share the information of these trajectories in a much more efficient manner, much more modern manner. On the other side, we have the operational projects. And as I said before, we have this integration of new entrants in European ATM operations, which is twofold project, one on the low altitude, but essentially for the purpose of today, on the higher airspace operations, where we, from the beginning, in the definition of the common plan that we did this year, we have all the partners, all the operational stakeholders from the technical operational point of view, and we're working also now closely with the states to define all the steps to the program, which is, of course, all the activities from the operational concept, the risk assessment, the harmonized procedures, and so on and so forth, to when supposedly in a couple of years, there will be much more robustness in the launches, in the number of launches, we will be fully ready by making the best use of this, let's say, common operational procedures to ensure that, which in a nutshell means to provide at the appropriate time the right level of airspace to the launches. On the other side, or whatever it is, the aircraft launching a rocket or whatever, on the other side, to use as less as possible the airspace for aviation, in the sense of having a very tight coordination with the launchers in order to the time window and the amount of airspace to be closed to be as minimal as possible, to impact as less as possible, of course, aviation. Of course, in words, it's very easy to say, but it is a big challenge, and we in Eurocontrol, we are really focusing this as a fundamental priority. And again, I will re-say the plea again, to be successful in this, the level of information knowledge that we need to have is significant. And so we will need to develop models to ensure the commercial confidence, but also to ensure that this information is adequately provided to be successful.
Okay, thanks, Jacopo. So Mark, you alluded to the variety and change of different players and different types of vehicles, etc. What's your view in terms of the path forward, in terms of how we work on this?
Yeah, so the variety of launch vehicles and whether horizontal, vertical launches, different launch sites, does need to be managed. I think it's fundamentally important that that from Europe's perspective, we are part of this new space activity. Other countries are going to do it. It's important that we find a mechanism within Europe to be able to support that ecosystem. As Scott's already said, it's a very significant part of the economy and growing rapidly. In economically difficult times, bits of the technology sectors which are growing fast have a real value, and we should be, from a European perspective, trying to support as much as we can. Finding a regulatory environment and an operational environment that can be agile enough to be able to support these activities is a challenge. I know very smart people like Scott are working on this day in, day out, and all trying to get licensing put in place. We do need a model that can be reproduced for different launch sites and different launch activities. So once we've done it once, let's not reinvent the wheel again.
Yeah.
There's launch sites are typically put into quite specific locations because they don't particularly want to fly over land masses. For example, if you're going to LEO into polar orbits, you want to go in a certain direction. Can we come up with an architecture which is robust enough to provide the integrity and security and remove things like casualty risk and impact to other operations as much as possible, but something that we can essentially copy and paste and then adapt to the specifics of a particular launch vehicle and a particular launch site as needed. I think that's the only way we can scale. If we try and reinvent the wheel each site, we may be limited to one or two only. And I think, as I've shown in my chart, we've got 5 or 6 really active European players who want to enter this small sat launch market. And I think we should be supporting them because they will drive a lot of economic growth downstream as a consequence of those launches.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that strikes me looking at it, is the bottleneck. If I look at the pipeline which is coming through in terms of where it is, I'm struggling to see how we're going to accommodate all this. But as I said in my introduction, from a societal point of view, the advantages that the new satellites will give us will be huge, and as a commercial piece. So Scott, you know, what's your view in terms of how we can, because you're at the sharp end of this.
Yeah, the very sharp end. It's you're right. There's definitely a bottleneck. If I look at the effort it's required for us to do one launch in Europe, next year we're looking to do potentially up to 3 of those simultaneously. That is a terrifying idea in some respects, but in others, you know, the first time is always going to be the hardest. Yeah. Now, there's definitely in this first instance, we need to be agile, we need to be collaborative. We can definitely meet the demand in the short term, I think, with everybody playing on the same kind of same rough rule book and everybody trying to play the same game. We can definitely get there. The real question is around the scaling factor. As we start to increase the number of states that are launching and the number of commercial operators, as they will be in competition, as we start to increase how we launch. So we've got horizontal and vertical launches. We've also got return operations. So if you look at the Virgin Orbit payload, one of those is Spaceforge. That is a company that is dedicated to manufacturing space. So everything they put up, they want to bring back.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in a fully operational sense, they might be dropping, dozens of payloads into UK airspace a year. That is something that requires a structure at that stage, and how you transition from that agile, dynamic management process into something that's more structured and is scalable. That's a real challenge for all of us, and it'll be a challenge around the world because, as Mark showed in his slides, you miss by 5 minutes, you're not just in Europe, you're somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we need to build this framework for success that enables industry to collaborate in a way that actually protects the public safety, because it's like all things in aviation. The minute you have an accident, that's when everybody pays attention, and that's the thing we're really trying to avoid at all costs. Yeah. Here is an accident. These are dangerous activities. So we are trying to do our best to mitigate all those hazards while getting all these benefits. And we're just going to have to be really, dynamic, alive to the issues and collaborative, and hopefully keep an open mind as to where the solutions are from, because it's a really, space in itself is a hard political area where you've got, where is the boundary between COPUOS and ICAO is a challenging question in and of itself from an international perspective. So we're going to have to deal with that same problem in Europe at a much smaller scale.
Okay. Right. So that's very interesting. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time at the moment. So if I could summarize, I think we've probably more questions than answers, but there's definitely a near-term imperative that we need to work this out to coordinate it better and to have better planning processes which safely integrate space launches, and we also probably need to have better mechanisms in terms of how we deal with unplanned re-entries, etc., into airspace. So I think that's the kind of main takeaway for me. So I see this conversation really as a kind of a call to action and a start in the conversation to raise awareness of people that the whole issue of space launches need to be addressed. As Jacobo says, there is ongoing work in the background, both in the near-term stuff in terms of operationally integrating it, but there's also a number of research projects, which in particular do in César, where we're looking at the ECHO project, looking at the integration of new vehicles and space launches. So that's another thing which I hope to give you a briefing sometime in the near future. So at this stage, it only remains for me, first of all, to thank each of the participants for a fascinating and very interesting stakeholder forum. It was very lively. There's a number of other questions which we didn't get a chance to get to, but we will pick them up and we will respond to people in the future, and just to come back. So it only remains again for me to thank Scott, Mark and Jacobo for their contribution, and keep your eye out for future webinars. We're going to launch a new series of webinars on a number of topics that people have drawn our attention to, about things which from a strategic point of view we would like to discuss. And I wish you all a very good day and talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.